Imagine this: you wake up one morning and the world looks exactly the same, but something inside you has irreversibly shifted. The coffee tastes the same, the sun rises at the same angle, the people around you move through their routines with the same predictable rhythms, yet you feel like a stranger in your own life. Not in a dramatic, cinematic way, but in something far more unsettling, a quiet, creeping awareness that everything you've been doing, everyone you've been trying to please, every goal you've been chasing might not actually be yours at all. What if I told you this feeling isn't a symptom of crisis, but a sign of awakening? What if this uncomfortable dissonance means you've already passed through a psychological threshold that most people never even recognize exists? Here's the paradox that will haunt you: the moment you begin to truly see yourself, you also see how much of your life has been lived by someone else's script. The moment you start questioning who you really are, you realize how little of what you've been told about identity, success, and meaning actually holds up under scrutiny. And the most disturbing part? You can't unsee it. You can't go back to the comfortable numbness of unconscious living, no matter how desperately you might want to. Today we are going to explore a secret insight inspired by Carl Jung that has the power to change the way you understand yourself, your past, and the path unfolding before you. And I promise you this: the final revelation we will reach later is the most important and transformative of all. This is not a video about motivation in the superficial sense. This is an invitation to see beyond appearances, to look directly into the mechanisms that quietly shape your behavior, your fears, and your destiny. Jung believed that human beings are not merely reacting to the world, but are constantly guided by inner forces, symbols, and archetypes that operate beneath conscious awareness. When these forces remain unseen, they rule us. When they are recognized, they become tools for profound transformation. If you have ever felt that life has been pushing you, testing you, or stripping away illusions, this message is for you. Before we go deeper, take a moment to support this journey. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like, share this video with someone who senses that life is more than routines and survival, and write your reflections in the comments as we go. What you are about to hear may change how you understand your struggles, your purpose, and even your sense of identity. Jung spoke of individuation as the central task of human life. Individuation is not about becoming special or superior. It is about becoming whole. Carl Jung understood this threshold better than almost anyone in history. He recognized that human beings don't just grow older, they either evolve psychologically or they calcify. And the difference between those two paths isn't intelligence, privilege, or luck. It's something far more mysterious: the willingness to face what you've been running from your entire life. Think about it. How many times have you felt that strange pull towards something you couldn't name? How many times have you suppressed an inner voice because it conflicted with what you were supposed to want? How many versions of yourself have you buried because they didn't fit the image others needed you to maintain? Most people spend their entire existence avoiding this confrontation. They fill their days with distractions, their minds with noise, their calendars with obligations that prevent them from ever sitting still long enough to ask the most terrifying question of all: who am I when no one is watching? Who am I when I stop performing, stop proving, stop pretending? Jung believed that this question, this willingness to face the unknown territory of your own psyche, separates those who merely exist from those who truly live. And he discovered something even more unsettling: the tests that determine whether you'll awaken or remain asleep aren't always obvious. They don't announce themselves. They arrive disguised as failures, betrayals, losses, and moments of unbearable disillusionment. The comfort you've been clinging to. It might be the very thing preventing your evolution. The relationships you're desperately trying to preserve. They might be built on versions of you that no longer exist. The goals you're chasing. They might belong to someone else's vision of what your life should look like. And here's the secret that changes everything: you cannot pass these tests by trying harder at the wrong things. You cannot think your way through them. You cannot optimize, strategize, or productivity hack your way to psychological wholeness. The final test requires something our achievement-obsessed culture has taught you to fear above all else: surrender. Not the surrender of defeat, but the surrender of control. The willingness to let something deeper than your conscious mind guide the way. So ask yourself now, with brutal honesty, what parts of your life feel like performance? What dreams have you abandoned because they seemed impractical? What truth have you been postponing because speaking it would change everything? The answer to these questions will reveal whether you're ready for what comes next. Because beyond this threshold lies the hidden problem, the psychological force that has been shaping your reality without your knowledge, and the reason why most people never escape it. Most people live fragmented lives, identified only with a mask they present to the world, what Jung called the persona. This mask is useful, necessary even, but it is not who you truly are. Beneath it lies the shadow, the parts of yourself you have rejected, suppressed, or denied because they did not fit the image you were taught to maintain. The shadow is not evil by nature. It contains fear, yes, but also creativity, power, authenticity, and truth. Here's the hidden problem that governs most human existence: society trains us to seek safety, approval, and predictability from the moment we can understand language. We are rewarded for obedience and punished for questioning. We learn that love is conditional, that acceptance requires conformity, that survival depends on becoming what others need us to be. Jung observed that people would rather cling to familiar suffering than risk the uncertainty of inner change. This is the first test almost everyone fails, the test of comfort. If you have ever felt an unexplainable dissatisfaction even when everything seemed fine on the surface, that was not weakness. That was the psyche signaling that growth was being postponed. Your soul was suffocating under the weight of a life that looked right but felt wrong. Friedrich Nietzsche understood this psychological imprisonment when he wrote about the last man, the person who has eliminated all risk, all struggle, all depth from existence in pursuit of comfort. The last man blinks and says, "We have invented happiness." But Nietzsche knew, as Jung did, that this happiness is a kind of death. It is the happiness of never being challenged, never growing, never becoming. The problem runs deeper than individual choice. We are born into systems, family systems, cultural systems, economic systems, that require us to remain unconscious. These systems need predictable workers, obedient citizens, reliable consumers. They cannot function if too many people start asking dangerous questions like, what do I actually want? What feels true to me? What would I do if I weren't afraid? Arthur Schopenhauer recognized that most people live in a kind of waking sleep, driven by unconscious will rather than conscious choice. We think we are making decisions, but we are merely reacting to impulses we don't understand, fears we've never examined, desires we've inherited from others. Jung took this insight further by mapping the architecture of the unconscious, showing that beneath our everyday awareness lies a vast territory of repressed emotions, forgotten experiences, and archetypal patterns that shape our behavior without our knowledge. This is why Jung warned that whatever we refuse to face within ourselves will appear to us as external enemies. The person who denies their own anger sees aggression everywhere. The person who rejects their own vulnerability perceives weakness in others with contempt. The person who suppresses their own desires projects them onto those around them, then resents what they see. The hidden problem is this: you are not living your life. You are living a carefully constructed defense against the parts of yourself that terrify you. Every should you obey, every authenticity you suppress, every truth you postpone, these are not signs of maturity or responsibility. They are symptoms of psychological fragmentation. Viktor Frankl, who survived the Nazi concentration camps, discovered something profound about human nature: those who had a why to live could bear almost any how. But here's what most people miss: you cannot find your why by thinking about it. You cannot discover your purpose while wearing a mask. Meaning emerges only when you stop imitating and start listening to the quiet voice beneath all the noise. Jung called this voice the self, not the ego that worries about appearances, but the deeper organizing center of the psyche that knows what you need to become whole. The problem is that the self speaks in a language most people have forgotten how to understand. It speaks through dreams, through symptoms, through persistent discomfort, through the failures that won't stop repeating. Jean-Paul Sartre wrote about bad faith, the act of lying to yourself about your own freedom. We pretend we have no choice when the truth is far more unsettling. We are radically free, and that freedom is terrifying. So we hide behind roles, behind obligations, behind the supposed demands of reality. We say, I have no choice, when what we mean is, I am afraid of the consequences of choosing differently. This is the root of the hidden problem. You have been taught to fear the very thing that could liberate you, your own psychological truth. You have been conditioned to believe that safety lies in conformity, that love requires self-betrayal, that survival depends on keeping the mask firmly in place. But Jung discovered something that changes everything. The psyche will not allow this betrayal to continue indefinitely. When consciousness refuses to listen, life applies pressure. When you ignore the quiet signals, the psyche creates crises. The betrayal that shatters your trust. The failure that destroys your identity. The loss that strips away everything you thought defined you. These are not punishments. They are initiations. They are the psyche's way of forcing what you refuse to choose voluntarily, a confrontation with the shadow, with the parts of yourself you have been running from since childhood. And this is where most people break. Because facing the shadow requires something our culture has systematically trained out of us, the courage to be brutally honest about who we actually are beneath all the stories we tell ourselves. The consequences of living unconsciously are not dramatic explosions. They are quiet erosions. They are the slow death of vitality, the gradual numbing of feeling, the creeping sense that life is happening to you rather than through you. Jung observed that neurosis itself is frequently the psyche's attempt to heal, a distorted call toward wholeness. When consciousness refuses to listen, the body and mind begin to rebel in ways that cannot be ignored. Consider what happens when you spend years suppressing your authentic self. Your relationships become performances. You choose partners not based on genuine connection but on who validates the mask you've constructed. You attract people who need you to remain small, who feel threatened by your growth, who unconsciously collaborate in keeping you fragmented. Then you wonder why intimacy feels impossible, why you can never truly be seen, why love always seems to come with conditions. This is the law of projection in action. Jung warned that people do not see the world as it is, but as they are. Unresolved inner material colors perception. When you judge others harshly, it often reveals disowned aspects of yourself. When you idealize someone excessively, you may be projecting unlived potential onto them. Your outer world becomes a mirror reflecting back the unintegrated parts of your psyche. The workplace becomes a theater where you perform competence while feeling like an imposter. You achieve success by conventional metrics, the promotion, the recognition, the financial security, yet the victory feels hollow. Jung believed that modern humans suffer not because life is hard, but because it feels meaningless. And meaning cannot be found in external accomplishments when you have abandoned internal truth. Your cognitive processes themselves become compromised. Psychologists have identified confirmation bias, the tendency to seek information that confirms what you already believe, but beneath this lies something deeper. When you have built your identity on lies about who you are, your mind becomes invested in maintaining those lies. You unconsciously filter out information that threatens your self-concept. You dismiss opportunities that would require you to change. You sabotage possibilities that would expose the gap between who you pretend to be and who you actually are. The shadow, when denied, does not disappear. It gains autonomy. It begins to act through you in ways you don't recognize. The anger you never allowed yourself to feel erupts in passive-aggressive behavior. The desire you suppressed manifests as compulsion. The grief you avoided becomes depression. Jung called these autonomous complexes, fragments of the psyche that operate independently, driving behavior from the unconscious. This is why people often say they feel as if life keeps repeating the same lesson. In Jungian terms, the psyche is demanding integration. You find yourself in the same type of dysfunctional relationship again and again. You face the same obstacles in different forms. You make the same self-sabotaging choices despite your conscious intentions. The repetition is not random, it is the unconscious trying to force awareness. Aldous Huxley recognized that most people live in a kind of perpetual distraction, what he called man's almost infinite appetite for distractions. We fill every moment with noise, social media, entertainment, busyness, consumption, anything to avoid the silence where the truth might emerge. This is not leisure or relaxation. It is psychological avoidance elevated to a lifestyle. The consequence is a life that feels increasingly unreal. You go through the motions. You check the boxes. You maintain the image. But somewhere beneath it all, you know you are not fully alive. There is a version of yourself that you have never met, a life you have never lived, a truth you have never spoken. Jung experienced this himself during what he called his confrontation with the unconscious, a period of intense psychological upheaval where he felt deeply misunderstood and internally fragmented. Yet he later recognized it as a necessary descent, a symbolic death before rebirth. The old structures of his identity had to dissolve before something more authentic could emerge. This is the phase Jung called the nigredo, a psychological darkness where old certainties collapse. It feels like confusion, emptiness, or meaninglessness. But psychologically, it is a clearing. It is the breakdown of false security, the crumbling of borrowed identities, the death of who you thought you had to be. And here is the most dangerous consequence of all: if you refuse this process, if you cling to the mask at all costs, you will reach the end of your life and realize you never truly lived. You will have spent decades being who others needed you to be, achieving goals that meant nothing to you, avoiding the one thing that mattered most, becoming yourself. Jung believed that the greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of their parents. When you refuse your own individuation, you pass that burden to the next generation. Your children inherit not just your genetics but your psychological incompleteness. They absorb your fears, your compromises, your unspoken regrets. They feel the weight of the life you never had the courage to live. The urgency of this moment cannot be overstated. Every day you postpone this confrontation, the mask calcifies further. The neural pathways of inauthenticity deepen. The gap between who you are and who you pretend to be widens. The cost of change appears to increase while the cost of staying the same becomes invisible, until suddenly it isn't. Because there comes a moment, and you may be at it right now, when the psyche will no longer accept the compromise. When the comfortable suffering becomes unbearable. When the mask feels so suffocating that even uncertainty seems preferable to one more day of pretending. This is not breakdown. This is breakthrough trying to happen. And whether it destroys you or transforms you depends entirely on what you do next. The path to freedom begins with a single act of psychological rebellion, withdrawing your projections and reclaiming responsibility for your inner world. This is not about blaming yourself for everything that has happened. It is about recognizing that your inner landscape shapes your experience of reality, and that you have far more power than you realized. Jung emphasized that passing this test requires brutal honesty. It requires asking not only, "Why did this happen to me?" but, "What part of me is being revealed through this experience?" When life hurt you the most, did it also expose something true about you? A boundary you never set, a fear you never acknowledged, a strength you underestimated? These moments are not punishments. They are initiations. The first act of rebellion is learning to read the messages your psyche has been sending. Repeating relationships, recurring obstacles, persistent emotions that resurface no matter how much you suppress them, these are not coincidences. They are the language of the unconscious. Most people spend their lives trying to silence inner conflict through distraction, numbing, or rationalization. But repression does not eliminate tension. It simply pushes it deeper, where it gains autonomy and begins to act through you. Integration does not mean eliminating fear, anger, or doubt. It means allowing them into consciousness without letting them rule your behavior blindly. Think about how often fear has shaped your decisions without you realizing it. Fear of rejection. Fear of failure. Fear of being seen. Fear of being alone. Jung described fear as one of the primary gatekeepers of transformation. The courage required is not dramatic, it is the quiet courage to sit with discomfort without escaping it. Here is where the radical shift occurs. You must learn to distinguish between the persona and the self. The persona is the mask you wear for survival and social functioning. It is necessary, but when it becomes your entire identity, the soul suffocates. Life will then apply pressure until the mask cracks. This pressure can come through loss, burnout, illness, or sudden disillusionment. None of this is accidental. The rebellion requires you to start listening to your inner authority rather than external scripts. Most people live according to family expectations, cultural norms, collective fears, and borrowed beliefs. Jung called this identification with the collective consciousness. Individuation begins when you dare to listen inwardly, even when the inner voice contradicts the crowd. This does not make you antisocial. It makes you authentic. Have you noticed moments when you knew something deeply without logical proof, yet ignored it because it was inconvenient or unpopular? That intuitive knowing is not mystical fantasy. Jung referred to it as the guiding function of the self, the deeper organizing center of the psyche. When you ignore it repeatedly, life grows louder. When you listen, even trembling, alignment begins to form. William James, the father of American psychology, recognized that transformation requires what he called the will to believe, not blind faith, but the courage to act on inner conviction before external validation arrives. You cannot wait for permission to live truthfully. You cannot postpone authenticity until it becomes convenient. The moment of rebellion is always now, and it always feels too soon. Nietzsche spoke of becoming who you are, not discovering a ready-made identity, but forging it through tension and self-overcoming. Jung added depth to this by showing that what you overcome is not the world, but your own unconscious patterns. The greatest battles are internal. The most important victories happen in silence. Here is the counterintuitive truth: withdrawal is not regression when it is guided by reflection. If you are experiencing a phase of isolation, of feeling out of sync with the world around you, understand something crucial. This is where the psyche reorganizes itself. This is where meaning begins to replace imitation. This is where you stop living borrowed lives and begin listening to your own inner authority. Jung himself experienced this during his confrontation with the unconscious, a period when he felt deeply misunderstood and internally fragmented. Yet he later recognized it as necessary descent, the symbolic death that precedes rebirth. If old conversations feel empty, if old ambitions lose their flavor, if the life you once wanted now seems hollow, you are not failing. You are shedding. The rebellion also requires establishing inner boundaries. You must stop betraying yourself to maintain peace. Stop explaining yourself excessively. Stop chasing validation that never truly satisfies. This does not harden you. It clarifies you. Jung observed that individuation often makes a person appear simpler on the outside and deeper on the inside, less reactive, less performative, more grounded. Viktor Frankl, influenced indirectly by depth psychology, observed that while we cannot always control circumstances, we can choose our attitude toward them. Jung went further by showing that our attitude is shaped by what we are conscious of. When you bring unconscious patterns into awareness, you gain the ability to choose differently. This is not positive thinking. This is psychological freedom. Ask yourself this question with complete honesty: if no one were watching, judging, or rewarding you, how would you live differently? What truth would you stop postponing? What inner call would you finally take seriously? The answer reveals the gap between who you are and who you have been pretending to be. And closing that gap is the only work that matters. The rebellion is not about becoming someone else. It is about removing everything that is not you. It is about peeling away the layers of conditioning, expectation, and fear until only the essential remains. Jung believed that maturity begins when a person accepts that while the past shapes them, it does not have the final word. The psyche seeks not excuses but integration. This is where guilt often appears, when you begin to outgrow unconscious agreements. Relationships based on outdated versions of yourself begin to strain or fall away. You may feel guilt for changing or fear of disappointing others. But not every voice demanding your loyalty deserves obedience. True transformation requires discernment about which commitments serve your wholeness and which ones demand your fragmentation. The final act of rebellion is this: choosing consciousness over comfort, again and again, knowing that the path will not be easy but that it is yours. Because a life lived in alignment with your inner truth, no matter how difficult, is infinitely more bearable than a comfortable life built on lies. As you stand at this final threshold, something becomes unmistakably clear. The struggle was never about becoming someone else. It was about relinquishing the illusion that you were ever separate from the deeper forces shaping you. Jung's most unsettling and liberating insight is this: the final test is not conquest, mastery, or perfection. It is surrender to wholeness. For most of life, the ego believes it must control everything to survive. It plans, defends, compares, and resists. This is not a flaw, it is a necessary stage of development. But Jung discovered that at a certain point, the ego becomes the obstacle. Not because it is wrong, but because it refuses to step aside. The final test is the willingness to allow the self to lead, even when the path is uncertain, even when it contradicts the ego's preferences. This surrender is profoundly misunderstood. It is not passivity. It is not resignation. It is an active cooperation with the deeper intelligence of the psyche. Jung observed that when people stop fighting their inner nature, life begins to move with a strange precision. Synchronicities appear, meaningful coincidences arise, not because reality has become magical, but because perception has become aligned. You finally see what was always there. Here is the revelation that changes everything: the test was never imposed by the world. It was generated by your own psyche. Every challenge, every loss, every moment of disorientation was an invitation to consciousness. Life was not happening to you, it was happening for you, through you, as an expression of a deeper process you could not see while you were identified solely with the ego. At this stage, suffering changes its character. It no longer feels like meaningless punishment. It becomes information. Pain still exists, but it no longer defines you. You understand that discomfort is often the signal of growth rather than failure. Jung believed that neurosis itself is frequently the psyche's attempt to heal, a distorted call toward wholeness. When consciousness refuses to listen, the psyche creates symptoms. When consciousness awakens, those same symptoms become guideposts. One of the most profound shifts that occurs here is the collapse of the need for external validation. You no longer require constant confirmation that you are on the right path. Approval becomes pleasant but unnecessary. Criticism becomes informative but not devastating. This inner stability is not arrogance, it is integration. You are no longer split against yourself. The war between who you think you should be and who you actually are finally ends. And with this integration comes something unexpected: natural compassion. Not as a moral obligation, but as an organic response. When you have faced your own shadow honestly, you recognize it in others without condemnation. Jung emphasized that the more unconscious a person is, the more moralistic they become. Consciousness softens judgment. It replaces blame with understanding, without excusing harm or abandoning boundaries. This is where you begin to understand what Jung meant by the self. In Jungian psychology, the self is not the ego. It is the totality of the psyche, conscious and unconscious, personal and transpersonal. It represents wholeness. When the ego aligns with the self, life gains an uncanny sense of direction. Not ease, but coherence. You may not know exactly where you are going, but you know when you are moving truthfully. The signs of this alignment are subtle but unmistakable. You stop betraying yourself to maintain peace. You stop explaining yourself excessively. You stop chasing outcomes that contradict your inner knowing. Jung observed that individuation often makes a person appear simpler on the outside and deeper on the inside, less reactive, less performative, more grounded in an authority that comes from within rather than without. But here is where the deepest paradox emerges: this journey, which has felt so intensely personal, was never just about you. Jung believed that by individuating, you break the chain of unconscious inheritance. The greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of their parents. When you refuse to live unconsciously, when you choose awareness over comfort, you liberate not only yourself but those who come after you. You stop passing on the unresolved patterns, the unspoken fears, the compromises that eroded your ancestors' souls. This is the ultimate truth: becoming conscious is an act of service. Not in the performative, self-congratulatory sense, but in the quiet recognition that every person who awakens makes it easier for others to do the same. Every person who refuses to live a borrowed life creates permission for authenticity in the collective field. Jung spent much of his later life contemplating mortality, and he concluded that a life lived in dialogue with the unconscious prepares a person for death, not with certainty, but with trust. When you have followed the inner process faithfully, death feels less like annihilation and more like completion. You sense that life has been meaningful, not because it was perfect, but because it was authentic. You lived what was yours to live. And now, the final realization that redefines everything: passing the final test does not mean life becomes easy. It means life becomes yours. You stop asking, "Why did this happen to me?" and begin asking, "What is being asked of me now?" You stop waiting for permission to live truthfully. You accept that uncertainty is not an enemy but a condition of freedom. The psyche speaks in symbols long before it speaks in clear thoughts. Everything that has happened to you, every betrayal that shattered your trust, every failure that destroyed your identity, every loss that stripped away what you thought defined you, was a symbol. A message in a language you are only now beginning to understand. The message was always the same: become conscious or be ruled by what you refuse to see. If you are reading these words, if something in you is responding with recognition rather than resistance, it is not because you are chosen in a mystical sense. It is because you were willing to look inward when it would have been easier to look away. Awareness itself is the passage. Consciousness is the threshold. The test was always whether you would choose to see. And here is what no one tells you about that choice: it is never made once. Consciousness is not a destination you arrive at and then maintain effortlessly. It is a practice, a commitment renewed daily, sometimes hourly. Every moment presents the same fundamental question: will you live from the mask or from the self? Will you react from fear or respond from truth? Will you betray your knowing for comfort or honor it despite the cost? Jung understood that this is the loneliest and most liberating path there is. Lonely because when you stop living by collective scripts, you may feel misunderstood. Liberating because false belonging is more damaging than honest solitude. A person who abandons their inner truth for acceptance pays with fragmentation. A person who endures temporary isolation for authenticity gains inner unity.